You're now on the historic route. Today, the other Napoleon, the exploits of Bonaparte the III, Part 3. Paris, the city of lights. Broad and beautiful boulevards line the ancient capital city of France, described by many as the beating heart of Europe's cultural, romantic, and artistic scene. Palaces, museums, monuments, and gardens dot the cityscape everywhere. Everybody who's been there before, and I'm willing to bet most people who haven't been there before would recognize Paris immediately if shown pictures of its unique appearance. But what happens if we turn back time and visit Paris just around only 150 years before our time? You wouldn't recognize a thing. I'll let a contemporary of this time describe it to you. Quote, "Paris is an immense workshop of putrefaction, where misery, pestilence, and sickness work in concert, where sunlight and air rarely penetrate. Paris is a terrible place, where plants shrivel and perish, and where, of 7 small infants, 4 die during the course of the year." If we truly did turn back time to visit old Paris, what would greet us is nothing more than a glorified medieval slum. Dark and narrow roads wind their way through a motley collection of crumbling and decrepit buildings and houses. The largest street is no wider than 5 meters. A foul stench permeates the air on a near permanent basis. The worst of both worlds. Industrial age inequality in living conditions mixed with medieval age infrastructure and housing. A far cry from the city of lights we know today. So, what changed? Who modernized the city? Who brought light where there was darkness? Well, I'm sure you can guess the answer by now. Napoleon the III, of course. So join me in this, the final part in our multi-part series on the illustrious and ever enigmatic Napoleon III, as he not only endeavors to change Paris forever, but also France and the whole world itself. So, when we last left off with Napoleon III, he had attempted to grab power, and actually, this time he succeeded. Becoming emperor and fulfilling his self-proclaimed destiny, at least partly. He still had a grand vision for his empire he wanted to implement. And this is where I come in. I'll be telling you all about this vision and how it played out. Now, I am obviously not the only person who has ever talked about Napoleon III's reign, and these analyses most often split his reign into 2 distinct parts: his domestic policy and his foreign policy. And I like this template, so I won't stray too far from it. But do keep in mind that these 2 aspects of his reign are mostly not separated chronologically and do happen congruently more often than not. Good? Good. Let's jump into his domestic policy first and address the whole Paris situation. So, in the intro to this episode, I mentioned how, let's say, neglected and backwards Paris was at the time of Napoleon III's ascension to power. And in my opinion, the state of Paris as a city as a good metaphor for France as a whole in the 1850s. A series of revolving revolutions and regime changes, plus conflict with other European states, has left France lagging behind the rest of Europe in well, almost everything. Especially the infrastructure and economy of France was much like Paris, backward and neglected. You see, the 1850s is the time when the Industrial Revolution really starts going in earnest. Factories, railways, and steam-powered machinery dominate the minds and policy of every successful state at the time. France's period of instability had allowed relatively small states like Belgium and the Netherlands to outpace the ailing French industrial effort. Modern economic practices were going hand in hand with cultural and societal changes. France had missed the bus so far, but the new emperor wanted in. So as soon as he became head of state, he instituted a wide-ranging changes in his new empire, starting with Paris. Okay, I think I've driven the point home quite sufficiently that Paris was not exactly the jewel of France it is today. And in order to bring it up to Napoleon III's, let's say, high standards, massive and complete change had to be brought to the table. Enter the Baron Haussmann, later nicknamed the Demolisher. And for good reason. In all but name, this Baron Haussmann declared war on the old Paris. Without mercy, all the old and in parts ancient buildings of Paris were torn down, especially in the city center. The entirety of the city was turned into one big construction site. What followed was a reborn city. Broad avenues, luxurious homes, impressive monuments, and spacious parks, modern infrastructure, such as streetlights and sewers and hospitals, formed the backbone of this rebuilt city. Wait, this all seems good. Too good, right? We've had this shtick so far in this show where there are two sides to everything Napoleon III does, but this just seems purely positive, right? Well, our emperor never disappoints, because yes, even this, at surface level seemingly innocuous change, has a duplicitous nature to it. Now, don't get me wrong, this was in many ways positive for Parisians of all walks of life. The city, for one, looked good now, had working infrastructure, which benefited everyone, like drivable roads and street lights or sewers. Also, the gardens I mentioned were public in nature and not hidden behind private chateau walls like in years prior. And I didn't even mention the large amounts of work this reconstruction provided to the working class populace. So, what was the other side of the coin, you ask? Well, for one, who do you think lived in those cramped living spaces that were torn down? These old, medieval little houses. The poorest of the poor. Yes, you may have gardens to visit now, but that's not all that great without a home, is it? But more significantly, those broad avenues and boulevards I keep mentioning, yeah, they're broad for a reason. Very broad for a very specific reason. If you recall, I mentioned in an episode prior that whoever controls Paris controls France. Well, in the last 50 or so years, this meant that angry Parisian mobs taking to the streets and setting up defensive barricades all along those very narrow corridors lining old Paris could enforce their demands, could exercise their will on whoever controlled Paris at the time. And you could hear slogans such as "Man the barricades," used in various insurrections and revolutions. And these narrow alleys and streets were perfect for quickly setting up barricades, which in turn were perfect for holding out against any army the government might send to quell unrest. And guess what happens when you remove those choke points? Imagine a group of lightly armed civilians in an open field, pretty much, facing a professional army mounted and armed to the teeth. To call that match uneven is a severe understatement. So, what in effect has happened with the rebuilding of Paris, Napoleon III removes any real possibility of an angry populace sieging his capital. And remember, whoever controls Paris controls France. There are no illusions now as to who controls Paris. Good, so Paris has been transformed. What about the rest of the country? Well, similar to the Haussmann renovations, that's what the rebuilding of Paris was officially called, the rest of France saw a massive influx of government spending in order to bring the country's infrastructure up to speed, especially railways, dams, but also institutions such as banks were built, all under state supervision. All of it was also constructed by large work programs designed to employ the working class, seemingly in keeping with the emperor's pledge to help the poor. So, that's obviously geared to appease his left-wing base. What about the right-wing base? Well, at the same time as he's expanding government reach into public projects, he is decreasing state intervention in the day-to-day businesses of corporations, even going so far as to lower all tariffs to make French industry globally competitive. Sure, at the cost of working class jobs and all those factories closing down due to foreign competition, but it does make the industrialists happy. And these are just a few examples of his unique economic policy. There are many more, but he always tries to have his cake and eat it too. He wants a strong government, able to take on anything or anybody he wishes to, but at the same time, he lets the corporations and businesses in his countries have a free hand, mostly. This is how I pictured in my head, and I am by no means an economist of any sort, so take this with a grain of salt. Imagine a poker game, and the game symbolizes the economy, and the players, industry, corporations, and other business parties. State capitalists, for example, see themselves in this game as the dealer, dealing the cards, watching over the players, seeing that rules are kept, and generally leading the direction of the game. The laissez-faire types, on the other hand, believe that they ought to not even play in the first place, content to just watch from the sidelines and let it all unfold before them. Then there is Napoleon III's way. He sees himself and his government not as a dealer or uninvolved, but as a fellow player, having his own agenda and cards, not really being able to influence other players or their cards. Surely he might cheat now and then, but he mostly stays confined to his own role. Napoleon III's government is an independent agent among other independent agents. Of course, his government has the last say in everything, but interference is not the name of the game. Okay, so that's the economy out of the way. What about societal and cultural changes? He has a vision for that also. The new emperor quite clearly saw himself as a champion of the common man. His mission to improve their lives was always on his mind. And, in part he does this, like we mentioned, through government-provided work and better infrastructure. But he also institutes a bunch of social programs for the lower-class populace. Extensive additions to workers' rights were made. Legal assistance to those not able to afford it was given. A government-run insurance policy was given out to the entire working populace, and many more similar programs were instituted. Among these, he also opened up public education for women all across the country, for the first time also allowing them to access higher education, such as universities. And if that wasn't enough, he also allowed, for the first time since the French Revolution, French workers to go on strike. A momentous moment for France's working population. Oh, and here's a fun one. Do you know margarine? I mean, of course you do. Guess who you have to thank for that? Napoleon III. That's right. Well, maybe not him directly. He didn't spend his spare time in a lab trying to find a way to make margarine. But what he did do is spend his time being annoyed that the high price of butter meant that poor people couldn't regularly afford it. So he let it be known that if anyone came up with an alternative for butter, they would be handsomely rewarded. And wouldn't you know, this spurred scientists, in this case the chemist, to come up with margarine. So thank the second French emperor next time you have some. So this may have only been a brief showcase of his societal vision for France, but I think you get in what direction he was leaning. Almost exclusively leaning, it seems. And yes, it does seem that way, that all these policies were popular with his left-wing base, but what about the right wing? I mean, he always played both sides, right? And honestly, in this case, no, actually not. These were really mostly pro-working class and not two-sided. I mean, that's not how Napoleon the III justified it. He reasoned that he could give the working class some domestic policy concessions in exchange for foreign policy, which we will get into momentarily. Foreign policy, of course, geared towards the right. But that's not how the right saw it. And so the first seed of doubt was planted in one side of his base. More ought to follow, but first let's talk about this foreign policy now. When Napoleon III crowned himself emperor, there was, quite understandably, a fair amount of concern in European ruling circles as to the possibility of a repeat of the Napoleonic Wars. I mean, the last Napoleon had plunged the known world into a string of years-long wars, culminating in widespread destruction and a general reordering of the power balance. So, naturally, many feared that with a new Bonaparte on the throne, conflict was on the horizon. And although Napoleon III did try to model himself after his uncle at almost any given possibility, the artillery officer uniform or the attempted 100 days repeat come to mind. In this case, he went his own way, though. He quickly, after his ascent to power, reassured other European leaders that a repeat of the early 19th century was not in the cards for his France. Instead, he opted for his empire to essentially become the, let's say, quintessential model for 19th century imperialism. Huge wars of inter-European conquests were so yesterday. Colonialism, spheres of influence, and imperialism taken to a whole new level. That was the fashion of the day. So, what does all that mean in practice? Well, for one, you follow the money. And more importantly, you follow opportunity. Why fight any of your powerful European neighbors over some small bit of land that's expensive to hold on to and never will truly integrate into your land? You know, what with the age of nationalism being in full swing at the moment. No, why do all that if you could just take vast swaths of territory off of, in quotation marks, more uncivilized countries, whose lands more often than not hold immense natural resources ripe for the taking? So that's one aspect of classic 19th century imperialism, colonial conquest. Examples of this include the conquest of Algeria or the Cochinchina campaign, the conquest of today's Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, or the capture of Quang Bay from the Chinese. Because, of course, every colonial power worth its salt had to have a Chinese treaty port. All these examples started by Napoleon III. And like I said, all this falls into the first category, which is pretty run-of-the-mill behavior for any European power of the time. But in my opinion, the more interesting aspect is the second one, spheres of influence. Now, I briefly mentioned them in my previous series on the Russo-Japanese War, but I'll refresh our memories with a quick explanation here. Now, Encyclopedia Britannica defines spheres of influence as, quote, spheres of influence in international politics, the claim by a state to exclusive or predominant control over a foreign area or territory. Now, in my opinion, this definition is a bit too broad. Wikipedia, I think, actually has a better one. Quote, in the field of international relations, a sphere of influence is a spatial region or concept division over which a state or organization has a level of cultural, economic, military, or political exclusivity. Okay, what does this mean in practice? Here are some examples. The Cold War. East and West were divided into blocks, spheres of influence between the two superpowers. Or the British Commonwealth, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Well, they haven't been part of Great Britain for a while now, yet they are still closely knit together through various economic, cultural, and strategic ties. Or the Monroe Doctrine, which dictated that European powers had no business meddling in South America, the USA's sphere of influence. Now, the level of control applied to these spherelings, as they are sometimes referred to, varies from case to case. In the case of the Cold War, the Soviets held a tight grip over their bloc, whereas the USA preferred the more hands-off approach. Okay, so now we know what spheres of influence are. Why would you, as a great power, want them? Well, like the definition said, cultural, economic, military, or political exclusivity can provide quite the boon for any empire. For example, around this time, the area of Panama was in the US's sphere of influence, allowing them to invest heavily there and eventually construct and take control over the Panama Canal. And Napoleon III was keen on playing along with this game and expanding his sphere of influence as well. One example is Egypt. Having established a French presence there, a sphere of influence was established in Egypt. Primarily, this led to a French company building the famed Suez Canal, a massive undertaking with immense profit margins. But wait, I hear you exclaim, isn't this Suez Canal a British thing? And if you did say that, thank you for listening to my previous show on the Russo-Japanese War. And yes, you would be correct, eventually the Suez would land in British hands. You see, spheres of influence were not permanent. Intense interest and political machinations, let's say, of all kinds eventually led France to lose control of the canal, and subsequently it fell into British hands. So these spheres of influence move from great power to great power. And obviously France or Britain aren't the only ones playing this game. Like I said, this is all the rage right now, and everybody wants to get their slice of the pie. Every one of the great powers seek to expand their influence and lessen the influence of other powers. Most of the time, this tit-for-tat gets played out in the realm of diplomacy and economics. Only rarely do the great powers fight militarily with each other over such spheres. But in 1854, one of these rare military engagements did flare up. The Crimean War. Now, you may have heard of this war before, and how brutal the fighting was, and how during this engagement the majority of losses can be chalked up to disease. But I want to focus on just two very specific aspects of this conflict, as to not get bogged down in minutiae. Aspect 1 is the origin of the war. Like everyone else, Russia wanted to expand its influence, and again, like everyone else, this was to happen at the expense of the sick man of Europe, the Ottoman Empire. Russia wanted their sphere of influence covering over the entire Balkan, a region which at the time was still under Ottoman control. Britain and France, not really liking the prospect of an overly powerful Russian tsardom, intervened on behalf of the Ottomans, and war broke out. So in the Crimean War, we can perfectly see the influence system at work and how it affected the actions of the great powers, France included. Aspect 2 is one which doesn't get talked about too often. You see, France, Britain, and the Ottomans weren't the only powers fighting Russia. No. See, at the time, the small Italian kingdom of Sardinia-Piedmont, a sphereling of France, joined in on the fray, hoping to curry favor with the new emperor of France. Again, here is this sphere system at work. France goes to war, so it expects some level of support from its spherelings. Sardinia-Piedmont provides, not only because they want to fulfill their obligations, but also to prove that they were loyal and worthwhile allies, and more importantly, deserving of continued support from France. Continued support for what? Well, here's where we get into the meat and potatoes of Napoleon III's reign, one of the most defining undertakings of his rule, the Italian campaign. Okay, so we will leave the Crimean War behind now. Basically, France, Britain, and co. won the war. This didn't change too much for France's position overall, so that's why we're moving on. Basically, I just mentioned the war so I can illustrate the sphere system. On to Italy. Now, the Italian campaign is what historians refer to the collection of battles the Second French Empire fought on behalf of the Sardinian Piedmontese kingdom in their quest to unify Italy. We talked about the state of Italy in our first episode on Napoleon III and how the Italian states were at this time still fragmented and not a unified country at all. And as we know, our emperor always had a soft spot for the Italians and therefore a subsequent dislike for the Austrians, stemming from his time as a youth in Italy. So we have here a convergence of interests. Napoleon III feels kinship towards the Italians and personally supports their movement. Sardinia-Piedmont is within his sphere of influence and a proven ally. And surely a unified Italy would prove an even better friend. Okay, let's turn back time a little and see what has happened in Italy so far. In 1848, the year Napoleon III comes to power and the year of revolutions, Italy sees a string of insurrections, but real change isn't implemented and the power balance stays somewhat the same. But it does send a clear signal to all involved that unification is a matter of when, not if. The risorgimento, the striving for a unified Italy, will not be stopped. But still, it would take an army, a large army, a possible French army, to defeat Austria and bring all of Italy under one rule. And while yes, Napoleon III was sympathetic to the cause and saw its strategic benefits, war is war, a costly, deadly business, so he still needed a little push to bring him into the fold. Now, how would one go about changing the emperor's mind? If only there was a known weakness of his one could exploit in order to change his mind. Ah, but yes, the emperor's famed womanizing. That's the answer. And when I say famed, I really do mean famed because the Sardinian Piedmontese minister, pretty much in charge of the kingdom, Count Cavour, sent his own cousin to Paris, known for her beauty, in order to sleep with Napoleon III and push him towards war with Austria. Now, if that isn't a definitive proof that individual personalities change the outcome of history, then I don't know what is. Good. The emperor has been sufficiently persuaded. France is on board. But his support would not come cheap. The counties of Savoy and Nice, which at the time were part of the Piedmontese kingdom, were to be ceded to France after the eventual war. And in 1859, that war came. France and Sardinia-Piedmont versus Habsburg Austria. June 4th saw the first big battle, the Battle of Magenta. Hey, I hear you think, that's like the color. And you would be mistaken. In fact, the color is like the battle, because Magenta is the name of the town the battle was fought in. And after the fact, a French victory, by the way, inspired French chemists named a new dye they had synthesized recently after this battle, magenta. So yes, also the color magenta we have indirectly Napoleon III to thank for. Shortly afterward, the second and last big battle of the war took place, Solferino. A battle which not only brought a decisive ending to the war, but also saw the subsequent formation of the Red Cross, founded in part by observers of this engagement who wanted to help the victims of war as much as they could after witnessing this massive slaughter at Solferino. I'll let Arthur Morris take over here. Quote, "Of all the insurrections, campaigns, and battles for the unification, or risorgimento of Italy, the great battle that took place around the small village of Solferino, just south of Lake Garda, was the most decisive and bloody. Its outcome not only set the seal on the eventual independence of Italy, but also saw the formation of the Red Cross, which in turn would not only provide better care for the sick and wounded engaged in armed conflicts, but also for all who were involved in natural disasters around the world." Okay, so we have this bloody and terrible battle with a clear French and Piedmontese victory. Austria is clearly on the losing side. A couple of pushes and all of Italy can be united. A couple of pushes and it's all over. But here's where history takes an interesting turn, as it so often does. Instead of pursuing the as good as defeated Austrians, Napoleon III sues for peace. Why peace, and why now? The Italians are outraged, the Austrians jubilant. The French emperor demands only that Austria cede Lombardy to Sardinia Piedmont. The territories of Tyrol, Istria, and more importantly Venice stay Austrian. Wait. What's going on here? Why does Napoleon stop with Lombardy and not press on? Well, honestly, it's not entirely clear. The going theory is that the French emperor, faced with the reality of war, had not the stomach for it. You see, in the time we are in right now, heads of state actually still led their forces into battle. So Napoleon III was there at Magenta and Solferino when thousands of his men were brutally slaughtered in order to achieve victory. So maybe he simply wished to stop fighting. Another possible idea is that he really did want to hold true to his words that the empire means peace. Another enigmatic moment of our emperor. But whatever the reasoning, France gains Savoy and Nice as promised, Austria holds on to some of their Italian territories, and Sardinia Piedmont, soon to officially rebrand themselves into the Kingdom of Italy in 1861, gain Lombardy, but lose all confidence and liking for the French. Remember that last aspect. It's gonna be important later. Oh, and also just imagine Prussia laughing in enjoyment at all this. And yes, we will get to Prussia soon, don't worry. First, we need to take a pit stop on our way to the final confrontation. That pit stop? Mexico. So here's the short version. By the 1860s, Mexico had seen quite a bit of political unrest and was plagued by revolutions and insurrections. Now, these were mostly self-contained conflicts, until 1861, that is. That's when the American Civil War broke out and the Union had bigger things to worry about than what was happening in Mexico. Mexico, of course, being in the American sphere of influence, in normal times. But these were certainly not normal times. And as you do as an imperialist power, the second the French Empire saw something wrong with Mexico and an opportunity to maybe meddle in Mexican affairs, they acted. After all, a North American ally was definitely a good thing to have. Also, something poetic about the Second French Empire trying to establish a Second Mexican Empire. Yes, you heard me right, a Second Mexican Empire. Not only had Mexico already gone through one empire, but Napoleon III really believed that establishing a new royal line in Mexico would be his best shot at influencing the country. So, I kid you not, he sent a member of the Habsburg-Lorraine family, offshoot of the Habsburg family because, of course, it's a Habsburg, over to Mexico to establish a client empire to France. So, Maximilian I, This Habsburg member was shipped to Mexico and then crowned emperor there, with some minor support from Mexican elites, but I think it's quite obvious that he didn't have a lot of support from the rest of the country. And of course, the rest of the country didn't accept this change of government out of hand. It was resisted. So Napoleon III sent over his army, primarily a new force that had recently formed, the Légion L'Étrangère, the Foreign Legion, whose brutality and effectiveness was not overstated, and he sent them over to quell any resistance. Now, if this whole affair seems surreal and frankly out of place, well, hey, I can only agree. Honestly, it was strange and a bit out of place, even for the time. And to add to the surrealness of it all, Maximilian actually managed to institute some laws in his country which were liberal in nature, expanding rights and generally geared towards helping the citizens of Mexico. That coming from an absolute monarch with no reason to help the people there. A weird situation. Now, I also think that it's quite obvious that this didn't last too long. Officially, the Second Mexican Empire lasted from 1864 to 1867, but practically it ended in 1865 already, when the USA was back on its feet again after the Civil War and absolutely not ready to tolerate any French interference in Mexico. So with the threat of war looming, France pulled back, the Mexican Empire crumbled to dust without French support, and with the execution of Maximilian I, this whole, let's say, adventure was over. And hey, if brutal regime change and war weren't so grim, one would almost want a book called Napoleon III's Wacky Zany Adventures in Mexico, or something of the kind. But enough sidetracks. Time to talk about Prussia. Now, I have purposefully so far only hinted at Prussia's eventual involvement in our story, and for good reason. Because now, as we are nearing the end of things, abruptly Prussia becomes a concern, much like how it happened back then. Now, not to say Prussia wasn't always a potential threat to France. It's more like, while Napoleon III was busy with Italy, Mexico, or rebuilding Paris, Prussia, under the leadership of, in my opinion, perhaps the greatest statesman to ever live, Otto von Bismarck, was gearing up to eventually become Europe's greatest war machine, all under the direction of this Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor. So, who was this Bismarck? To get a sense of his caliber, here is a famous speech he gave regarding the unification of Germany. Quote, "The great questions of the time will not be resolved by speeches and majority decisions. That was the great mistake of 1848 and 1849. But by iron and blood." Iron and blood indeed. You see, German pan-nationalism, much like the Italian Risorgimento, strive to unify the collection of independent German states into one country, Germany. And through a masterful display of political maneuvering, but primarily a series of wars, first against Denmark for the German-speaking provinces of Schleswig-Holstein, and in Austria for the dominant position among the German states. The last war, the Austro-Prussian Brothers' War in 1866, actually involved Italy, who had found in Germany finally an ally willing to go all the way, Venice being taken from the Austrians after the war. The war being over extremely quickly due to excellent Prussian militarism defined by its modern technology and superb chiefs of staff. Bismarck's Prussia was on the rise and rapidly on the way to forming Germany. Okay, so where does France come in all of this? Where does Napoleon III come in all of this? Why would he care? Well, for one, having a unified Germany at your border was one of the oldest French nightmares, due to the potential threat such a superstate might pose. Secondly, France owned territory Prussia coveted. The provinces of Alsace and Lorraine, a region bordering the two countries, inhabited by French and German-speaking peoples. Think of Alsace-Lorraine as the last brick needed to complete a house. The house is as good as done, but without that last brick, it just isn't 100% ready to be lived in. So Prussia wants Alsace and Lorraine. Okay, so France has something Prussia wants, and France wants to desperately stop Germany before it's too late. A confrontation hitting in the background, but long in the making, seems inevitable. A standoff ensues, and it will only take one small, tiny reason to have the whole thing explode into open conflict. That reason came in 1870. The Ems Dispatch. What was the Ems Dispatch? Well, to keep this short, something mundane was spun as something outrageous. A routine encounter between a French statesman and the Prussian king was played up to be an altercation filled with offensive language and the threat of war. How was it played up? Well, by editing the account. Who edited it? Well, Bismarck, of course. And it was edited so that French people were offended by German conduct and Germans by French conduct. But still, the ball was in France's court. Napoleon could act or not. But Prussia is no easy target. Help from other nations would be needed. Let's see. Say you're Napoleon the III. Who in the Great Power Club could help you? Austria? Well, Austria kinda got beat up by Prussia not long ago, and remember that whole Italian campaign? Yeah, not the best of relations between you two. How about Italy then? You did leave the war prematurely last time, and also they fought with Prussia together not long ago. No real reason to help you. Okay, how about Russia? Sorry, remember the Crimean War? Yeah, also a no-go. And, by the way, Prussia had been cozying up quite a bit to the Tsar lately, actually leading to a friendship between the two. So, no Russia. Who's left in the Great Power Club? The USA? They don't involve themselves in European affairs. Also, Mexico, remember that? Okay, that leaves Britain. And although France and Britain had been getting along better recently, they were still old rivals. Also, Britain got along quite well with Prussia, and their doctrine of splendid isolation also moved them closer to the non-interference club, let's say. So that's it. No friends. It was going to be a one-on-one battle, mano a mano. Prussia, at this time styling itself as the North German Confederation, versus the French Second Empire. Although Bismarck had secretly arranged for support from the southern German states, so maybe not that fair a matchup, but still. France versus Proto-Germany, let's say. Facing pressure from all sides, the French Emperor declares war on Prussia in July 1870. Both sides immediately mobilize all their forces and rush towards the border. Now, the French army at this time is no pushover. They are professional, well-equipped, and ready to fight for king and country. Well, emperor and country. The problem is, they are facing the predominant military power of the day. Prussia's army, and actually Prussian society itself, was through and through based on strict militarism, something they took pride in, and something French society resisted vehemently becoming. And adding to that militaristic society also possessed state-of-the-art equipment and tactics, not of today, but of tomorrow. Rapid troop deployments via railways combined with modern logistical systems reminiscent of the First World War gave the Germans quite a leg up on the French. And if that wasn't enough, the Germans were led by generals such as Roon or von Moltke, masters at the art of war. While France did have some competent generals, the main army was actually commanded by Napoleon the III himself, not exactly versed in modern battlefield tactics. To use a boxing analogy, Prussia is the up-and-coming lightweight champion, fast, precise, furious, but most of all eager and doesn't have too much to lose. France is the returning heavyweight champion, experienced, yes, but the game has changed quite a bit since last, he thought. It would only take a 1-2-3 punch and France would be out. That punch would come at the Battle of Sedan. Now, there had been a couple of skirmishes and battles before Sedan, but this is the decisive moment. Napoleon III and his army were on the way to relieve a besieged garrison of a town when their intentions became known to the Prussians and they were promptly surrounded. What followed? A disaster for the French. The Germans, with surgeon-like precision, descended upon the hapless French, encircling them and effectively dooming the French. Now, let me make this clear. The French may have been slightly outclassed by the Prussians at this point in time, but the speed at which this battle and the war itself unfolded was practically unheard of. You know, when people discuss the First World War and how in the early months all sides believed it was going to be a battle here, a battle there, and it'll all be over by Christmas, well, they looked back at specifically this war and thought it'll be exactly like this. Because, yes, this rapid encirclement at Sedan spelled the end for the French in this war. And I know this feels anticlimactic and rushed, and, it's honestly because it is anticlimactic, and the Prussians did rush to victory. It feels disappointing having set up this rivalry just to end it here, but this is how the game was played then. One big game of chess, and Bismarck had outplayed Napoleon the III. And before he knew it, checkmate, game over. Just like that. So, after a couple of days of fighting at Sedan, and with an untenable French position, the Empire's army, with Napoleon III at its head, surrendered. Now, this is actually an interesting point because commentary about the Franco-Prussian War will later proclaim the French Emperor's cowardice as prime motivator for his surrender. Two things to note here. One, there was no way of getting out of that encirclement alive through fighting. Secondly, well, I'll let the Emperor himself explain. Some believe that by burying ourselves under the ruins of Sedan, we would have better served my name and my dynasty. It's possible. Nay, to hold in my hand the lives of thousands of men and not to make a sign to save them was something that was beyond my capacity. My heart refused these sinister grandeurs. So Napoleon III may have really deeply cared about the lives of his soldiers here, and maybe in general. I mean, remember the Italian campaign and how he stopped fighting due to heavy losses. And this makes him almost completely unique. Because if we think of pompous royals with illusions of grandeur, one doesn't associate sympathy and compassion with them too often. Well, anyway, the emperor gets captured and taken prisoner by the Germans. And excuse me if I veer into the slightly romantic here, but I can't help visualizing this scene. So I wrote a short romanticized account of how this capture might have played out. September 2nd, 1870. The cool morning air gently blew through the long hair of the French emperor as he removed his cap, taking a deep breath while being respectfully, yet briskly, escorted by a pair of Prussian soldiers to his new captor's headquarters. Dressed in a French officer's classic red and blue uniform, slightly worse for wear after days of battle. He didn't feel royal in this moment. The Germans had set up camp at Donchery. There, he surely knew, his fate and the fate of his country he loved so much would be decided. He thought about his country as the group of men slowly drew closer to their destination, all the things he had done, the things he had sacrificed for his country. He had been the strong hand France needed in its time of crisis. He was sure of that. But must it end like this? Must his empire be washed away through the actions he took in this war? Because surely it must. He may not know it at the time, but even now as he walks along his captors, men like Adolphe Thiers are setting things in motion to bring about the end of the empire and the rebirth of the Republic. As he passed rows of Prussian, Bavarian, and other German soldiers marching, he thought of his uncle and his fate. Was Sedan not his Waterloo? A chuckle escaped his lips as he wallowed in a state of sarcastic indignation and genuine sadness for his fate and that of his empire. He entered the house the Germans had used to set up headquarters. Any moment now he would meet the Prussian king, and so his fate. He was led through the house and told to exit it again through the back door. There was no Prussian king in sight. Only an older-looking gentleman dressed in a clean and extravagant officer's uniform, sitting in a simple wooden chair, his mighty mustache covering up large swaths of his face. He gave off an air of superiority and coolness, although Napoleon could sense a certain giddiness hiding behind his eyes. He of course recognized this man immediately. It was Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor. Of course it was him and not the king. He, Otto von Bismarck, was his true nemesis. He had really orchestrated all this. It was only right that his fate should be decided by its original architect. The at this point old and already ailing emperor happily sat down next to the victorious Prussian. As the wind continued blowing, with the leaves beginning to fall alongside it, pleasantries were briefly exchanged. But both men knew they weren't here for small talk. The fate of nations lay in their hands. Bismarck started dictating the terms of peace. Napoleon acquiesced to some, resisted others, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. But he was in no real position to change the outcome at this point. It was over, and he knew it. And more than that, he was over. He also knew that. In a few months' time, the Prussian King Wilhelm I will be crowned German Emperor in the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles, a deep insult to French patriotism, a significant prestige boost for the young German nation. A new republic will by then have taken the empire's place, Bonapartists driven out of power. The defeated emperor felt this was all to come, and he didn't judge his people for not wishing to return to the empire. After all, he had dishonored the country in defeat, dishonored the title of emperor in defeat, dishonored himself in defeat. The people did truly love him till the end, but only till the end, and his time was up. Within a couple of months his empire will be no more. Within a couple of years, he will be no more, slowly succumbing to disease and advanced age. As he sat in the backyard of this house with his nemesis Bismarck, all these thoughts coursed through his mind. The two men eventually concluded their talk, both wondering the same thing at the moment. How would history judge these men? Bismarck would enjoy a splendid career and an even more splendid reputation. His star was rising still. Napoleon the III? Well, his star had reached its zenith quite a while ago. But how would he be remembered? How would posterity judge him? I'll end my illustration of this scene now with an admission of guilt. I can't definitively tell you what kind of person Napoleon III was and how he deserves to be remembered. Although I will say that each and every one of you listening can, and I'm sure will, make up their own minds as to that question. A tyrant in populist clothing, or a populist in tyrant's clothing? Ultimately good or bad, destiny or sheer coincidence? Again, I can't answer these questions for you, but I have laid out ample evidence for whatever conclusion you arrive at. And to now end this episode with a quote from Albert Durand's illuminating book, Napoleon III, A Great Life in Brief. Quote, "A great life. The man whom Victor Hugo branded as Napoleon the Little had greatness thrust upon him. Without the magic of the name, he would have never become, and have remained for 20 years, the master of France and the arbiter of Europe. Yet he was not merely, as his enemies called him, Napoleon's cocked hat with no brains under it. He had to achieve greatness, an adolescent dream, slowly matured, realized at last, not through luck alone, but through pertinacity, shrewdness, and daring. The dream was not ignoble. Indeed, it was more generous than the sheer love of personal power which impelled Napoleon I. There must have been greatness, however warped, in the man's very soul. To his contemporaries, he was a mystery. To posterity, he remains an enigma." Thank you truly for listening. I hope to see you next time on The Historic Route.